The rain began to fall over Bern like a curtain drawn before a final act. It wasn't a downpour, not yet, just a steady, whispering drizzle that clung to the jerseys, slicked the ball, and turned the Wankdorf pitch into something unpredictable. 90,000 spectators leaned forward in their seats, raincoats rustling, breaths held. The world didn't yet know it. But what was about to unfold would change more than a scoreline. It would change a country. July 4th, 1954, the World Cup final. On one side, Hungary, the magical Magyars, unbeaten in 4 years, a team so fluid, so innovative, that even the British called them football from the future. Their captain, Ferenc Puskás, was a global superstar, the kind of player who could turn a match with a glance, whose name alone carried the weight of inevitability. Alongside him stood Sándor Kocsis with his devastating header, and Nándor Hidegkuti, the withdrawn forward who redefined football tactics. And on the other side, West Germany, a team no one outside their borders believed in. Men who worked as mechanics, soldiers and shopkeepers when they weren't training. They were dismissed as amateurs, survivors of a country still reeling from defeat and division. When they stepped onto the field in Bern, many in the crowd regarded them not as challengers but as participants, there to witness Hungary's coronation. The opening whistle blew, and within 6 minutes, the script seemed written. Puskás pounced on a loose ball inside the box, his shot skipping past goalkeeper Tony Turek. 2 minutes later, Zoltán Csibor doubled the lead, racing through the German defense to bury a low strike. Herbert Zimmermann's voice trembled through the radio broadcast. 2-0 für Ungarn, 2-0 for Hungary. For the fans listening across Germany, it was a familiar humiliation. Only weeks earlier, in the group stage, Hungary had humiliated the same German side 8-3. That game was so one-sided that even German newspapers admitted defeat before it began. The rematch in the final felt cruel, a reminder of where Germany stood in the football world, and in the eyes of the world itself. But down on the drenched pitch, amid the echoing cheers of Hungarian supporters, Fritz Walter gathered his teammates. His voice was steady, his expression unreadable. He had seen worse, much worse. The captain, who had survived World War II and Soviet captivity, knew what hopelessness looked like. This wasn't it. Waiter, waiter, he barked, keep going. The Germans pressed forward, not with flair, but with grit. Mud clung to their boots, jerseys stuck to their backs, but their passes grew sharper, their tackles heavier. In the 10th minute, Max Morlock lunged onto a rebound, poking it past the Hungarian keeper. The score was 2-1, a flicker of hope. And then came Helmut Rahn, der Boss, stocky, fearless, left foot like a hammer. In the 18th minute, he found himself in space, and without hesitation, drove the ball through the chaos of legs and rain into the net. Zimmermann's voice cracked with disbelief. Ausgleich, 2-2. It's level. The stadium erupted. The impossible was happening. For the first time, Hungary looked human. Their crisp passing faltered in the wet. Their pace slowed. The rain grew heavier. What Germans later called Fritz Walter Wetter, Fritz Walter, weather, the kind of damp, cold air in which the captain seemed to thrive. By half-time, the momentum had shifted. Herberger. The German coach remained calm on the sideline, his trench coat soaked through. To him, this wasn't luck. It was calculation. He had studied Hungary's style, their weakness under pressure, their reluctance to adapt. He had drilled his players to stay compact, to defend narrow, to strike on the counter. Every pass, every clearance, every sprint was part of a greater plan. Yet beyond tactics and formations, something deeper was taking place. For the men wearing the eagle on their chest, this was more than football. It was defiance, a statement to the world that Germany, fractured, shamed, rebuilding from ashes, could still stand tall, still fight back. Across their homeland, millions listened by radio. In small towns and war-torn cities, people huddled together in cafes, kitchens and barracks. They weren't expecting victory. They were hoping for dignity. Each minute of resistance against the mighty Hungarians felt like reclaiming a small piece of pride long lost. Zimmermann's commentary grew more impassioned as the game stretched on. His words were more than play-by-play. They were poetry for the wounded. Tor für Deutschland! He cried with every surge forward. Tor für unser Land! The rain intensified, smearing the chalk lines, turning puddles into traps. Yet the Germans kept running. Walter, Rahn, Morlock, they fought for every inch of turf. At that moment, something almost invisible began to shift. In the stadium, in the team, in the hearts of the listeners back home. The players were no longer seen as representatives of a defeated nation. They were just men, fighting against the odds, refusing to surrender. And that was enough to make people believe again. When halftime came, the score remained 2-2, and the Hungarians, once untouchable, walked off the field in stunned silence. In the stands, no one knew what the next 45 minutes would bring. But for those who watched closely, they could already sense it. History was moving. Something extraordinary was unfolding beneath the rain in Bern. And in that soaked, muddy stadium, before the world called it a miracle, it began simply as this: 11 men who refused to give up. When the whistle blew that day in Bern, it wasn't just the start of a football match. It was the sound of a broken nation daring to dream again. To understand the miracle of Bern, we have to step back into the shadows of a country that no longer knew itself. Germany in the late 1940s was a place without direction, its cities shattered, its name tarnished, its people scattered across the ruins of defeat. The war had ended, but peace had not yet begun. Football at that time seemed almost trivial. Stadiums were in ruins, pitches were little more than fields of mud and broken glass. But among the wreckage, there was one man who believed the game could be something more, a blueprint for rebuilding a nation's soul. His name was Sepp Herberger. Herberger was not a man of grand speeches or flamboyant charisma. He was methodical, disciplined, a tactician who saw football as an expression of order. The ball is round, he often said, and the game lasts 90 minutes. Everything else is theory. Beneath the simplicity of those words lay a philosophy that mirrored the rebuilding of West Germany itself. Start with what you know, keep it steady, and trust in hard work. Before the war, Herberger had already been a respected coach. But after 1945, when German football was ostracized from international competition, he quietly began his work anew. He scoured local clubs for players with not just skill but character, men who understood struggle, who had known loss. He didn't want stars. He wanted survivors. That's how he found Fritz Walter, the man who would become his captain, his compass, and the heart of the 1954 team. Walter's story mirrored the story of his country. Born in Kaiserslautern in 1920, he grew up playing football in streets still recovering from the First World War. When the Second War came, he was drafted into the army, captured by Soviet forces, and nearly sent to a prisoner camp in Siberia, a fate that often meant never returning. Only a stroke of chance saved him. A Hungarian guard recognized him from before the war, remembered his skill on the pitch, and spared him. That connection, between a German footballer and a Hungarian soldier, would become a haunting twist of fate a decade later in Bern. When Walter returned home, Kaiserslautern lay in ruins, but he began to play again. To him, football wasn't just a game, it was rehabilitation. Physical, emotional, national. Herberger noticed his poise, his calm intelligence, his ability to see 2 moves ahead. In a Germany fractured into zones and ideologies, Walter became a symbol of what was still whole. Herberger built his team around him, a mix of disciplined veterans and young, men who still carried the smell of factory work and coal dust on their jerseys. There was Helmut Rahn, the swaggering forward from Essen, who played with a kind of street-born confidence that both frustrated and fascinated his coach. There was Max Morlock, the quiet craftsman from Nuremberg, whose consistency made him indispensable. And behind them stood Toni Turek, the goalkeeper, a man of stoic reflexes whose wartime injuries had never fully healed. They weren't stars. They were workers. Their chemistry was forged not in fame, but in shared hardship. Meanwhile, the world around them was changing. The Allies' occupation was slowly giving way to sovereignty. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was born. But with it came a deep uncertainty. What did it mean to be German now? What did pride look like after catastrophe? Football became one of the few spaces where identity could be safely rebuilt. Crowds returned to the terraces. Children played barefoot in bombed-out streets with ragged balls made of cloth. For a nation forbidden to fly its old flags or sing its old anthems, the black and white of the national jersey offered something pure, something untainted. When West Germany was readmitted to FIFA in 1950, Herberger knew this was more than a sporting event. It was a quiet re-entry into the world, a chance to show that Germany could play. By the rules again, could win with dignity, could lose without arrogance. But for all his preparation, Herberger understood that his players were burdened by more than tactics. They carried ghosts. Many of them had fought or lost family or been displaced. They bore the guilt of a generation. That's why Herberger's training sessions were as much psychological as physical. He drilled them on focus, humility, and unity. You win before the match, he told them, in your mind. He spoke of Ordnung, order, as the guiding principle, a way to counter chaos not just on the field, but in life. By 1953, the team had begun to click. In friendly matches across Europe, they showed flashes of brilliance, yet no one took them seriously. To the football world, West Germany was an afterthought, a side rebuilding from nothing, lucky even to qualify. And when the draw for the 1954 World Cup placed them in the same group as Hungary, the pundits laughed. The Hungarians were the future, innovators of the 4-2-4 formation, Olympic champions unbeaten in 4 years. They had just thrashed England at Wembley and Budapest with scores that seemed like misprints. Facing them felt like a formality. But Herberger was patient. He was a chess player, not a gambler. He saw the group stage differently. When West Germany met Hungary early in the tournament, he deliberately fielded a weakened lineup, resting Walter, Rahn, and other key players. The result was predictable. Hungary demolished them 8-3. The critics sneered. The German defenders themselves reportedly mocked their own side, saying they had no business being in the same tournament. But Herberger was unmoved. His goal had never been to win that match. It was to study Hungary, to learn. Every pattern, every weakness, every assumption they made about superiority. He told his players afterward, quietly, "We'll see them again." That confidence seemed absurd at the time, but it was the seed of what would bloom in Bern, a belief that even the mighty could fall if you prepared with purpose. Back home, few paid attention. Germany was too busy rebuilding its economy, its roads, its dignity. The newspapers reported on the World Cup in small columns, often below stories about ration cards and reconstruction. But in towns like Kaiserslautern, Essen, and Nuremberg, something small began to stir. A flicker of pride in seeing their boys compete again, not as enemies, but as equals. And somewhere in the quiet of his study, Sepp Herberger sharpened his pencil, adjusted his notes, and waited for the storm he knew was coming. Because for him, the 1954 World Cup wasn't just a tournament. It was a test of discipline, of faith, of whether a broken nation could still remember how to believe. The 1954 World Cup was not supposed to be West Germany's story. It was supposed to be Hungary's coronation, the final flourish of a golden generation that had redefined football itself. They had scored more than 140 goals in the years leading up to the tournament. They were unbeaten in 31 matches. Their name inspired awe, even fear. But for Sepp Herberger's men, the World Cup in Switzerland was something different. It was a journey into legitimacy, a test of how far they had come from the ashes of anonymity. The team arrived quietly. No headlines, no fanfare. They trained in the small Swiss town of Spiez, surrounded by mountains and mist. The locals called it the German camp, but to the players it became a sanctuary. The mornings began with silence, a few words from Herberger, a jog through, the dew-soaked grass, and tactical drills that bordered on ritual. Herberger's methods were meticulous. He didn't just train bodies, he trained minds. Players had to memorize every possible Hungarian movement, every defensive rotation. He spoke of spacing, positioning, reaction, details that other teams ignored. His motto became legend: "After the game is before the game." Every match was preparation for the next, every mistake a lesson for something greater. In the group stage, that patience paid off. West Germany opened with a solid 4-1 win against Turkey. Then came the humiliation, the 8-3 loss to Hungary. Newspapers back home mocked Herberger's selection choices. Fans wrote letters asking why the team had even bothered. But the coach stayed calm, knowing that sometimes losing was the only way to learn. A playoff against Turkey would decide who advanced to the knockout rounds. This time, the full-strength German team took the field. Disciplined, sharp, unrecognizable from the one Hungary had destroyed. The result, a 7-2 demolition. Suddenly, people noticed. The rhythm was clicking, the belief returning. In the quarter-finals, they faced Yugoslavia, a talented and physical side. Many predicted the end of the German run there. Instead, Herberger's tactics shone. The team defended compactly, breaking with lethal precision. Rahn scored, and Yugoslavia fell 2-0. Then came Austria in the semi-final, a battle between neighbors and perhaps the first time the world began to sense that something was different about this West German team. The match was chaos, relentless attack, rain-soaked energy, and a display of pure will. Helmut Rahn and Hans Schäfer tore through the Austrian defense. The final whistle blew, 6-1. It wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. In just a few weeks, the amateurs of West Germany had turned into a team that could no longer be ignored. And suddenly, their coach, once criticized for his calm, almost cold detachment, looked like a prophet. But beneath the triumphs, Herberger knew that the hardest challenge was still ahead. The rematch with Hungary was inevitable. And this time, there would be no excuses, no experimental lineups, no element of surprise. He studied the Hungarians relentlessly. He watched how Puskás dictated tempo, how Hidekuti dropped deep to pull defenders out of position, how Kocsis ghosted into space. He saw their brilliance, but also their vulnerability. They played with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They expected victory, and in that expectation, Herberger sensed opportunity. He also knew that something else would play a role: the weather. The Swiss summer had been unpredictable, with sudden showers turning pitches into mud. Herberger quietly smiled at the reports. His captain, Fritz Walter, thrived in wet conditions. The players called it Fritz Walter Wetter, damp, cool, slippery. Where others lost balance, Walter seemed to gain control. But for all his preparations, Herberger still needed his players to believe. After years of mockery and self-doubt, that belief was fragile. So, in Spies, he fostered unity. The men dined together, shared jokes, sang songs. They were not celebrities, they were comrades. And from that camaraderie grew something unshakable: trust. One evening, after a long day of drills, Herberger gathered the team in the dining hall. He said quietly, "The Hungarians are better. That's the truth. But they don't know what we know. They don't know what we've lived through. They haven't had to rebuild their country, their homes, their faith. You have, and that is your strength." The room was silent. Then Fritz Walter stood and nodded. "We'll be ready, coach." Back home, the German press began to take notice. Columns that once ridiculed the team now spoke of pride and dignity. Factories hung radios in break rooms so workers could listen to the matches. In a country still scarred by guilt and division, something collective, almost sacred, was forming around this unlikely football team. For the players, the pressure was immense. They weren't just carrying a flag, they were carrying the emotional weight of millions who longed for redemption. On the eve of the final, the mood in Spies was quiet. Outside, the mountains loomed in mist. Inside, the players packed their boots, their black and white kits, their hopes. No one spoke of victory, no one dared. But in every glance, every handshake, the same thought lingered: we've come too far to stop now. Fritz Walter walked the corridors alone that night, thinking of everything that had led him here: the war, the camps, the narrow escape from Siberia. He thought of the Hungarian guard who had spared him, and wondered if that man was now listening to the radio, waiting for Puskás to triumph. When dawn broke, the rain had already begun to fall over Bern. Not heavy, not yet, just a whisper against the window panes. The kind of rain that made the air thick and the ground heavy. Fritz Walter smiled to himself. Fritz Walter Wetter. He knew what it meant. He knew it was a sign. The miracle of Bern was not born that day. It had been building for years. In discipline, in defeat, in the quiet conviction of a team that refused to stay broken. And now, as they boarded the bus to Wankdorf Stadium, their faces calm, their minds clear, there was only one thought between them all: let the world laugh. We will do the rest. The rain came harder now, sheets of it, slicing across the Wankdorf Stadium as if the sky itself had joined the match. Umbrellas trembled in the stands. Players wiped water from their eyes. The air smelled of wet grass, tension, and something electric, the sense that history was about to happen. When referee Ling blew the opening whistle, the Hungarians exploded forward like a machine in motion. They were the world's best, not by arrogance, but by proof. Ferenc Puskás, still nursing an injury, looked half fit, but even half a Puskás was danger enough. In the 6th minute, he seized a loose ball, pivoted, and struck. The shot bent low through the rain and into the net. 6 minutes, 1 goal. 2 minutes later, chaos. A misplaced German pass, a quick counterattack, and Zoltán Csibor, fast as lightning, broke through. His shot slid beneath Tony Turek's desperate reach. 2-0. For Hungary, it was routine. For the crowd, it was destiny. For Germany, it was déjà vu. The same nightmare from 2 weeks earlier when the Magyars had humiliated them 8-3. Only now, the stakes were the world. From the German bench, Sepp Herberger didn't move. He simply adjusted his hat against the rain and murmured to his assistant, "Now we begin." Because Herberger knew something the Hungarians didn't. He knew that their brilliance, their free-flowing attacking beauty, faltered under weight and water. The ball didn't glide anymore. It stuck, heavy with mud. The same rain that blinded the players was also reshaping the game itself. And then came Max Morlock. In the 10th minute, the Germans surged down the right wing. Helmut Rahn whipped in a low cross. The Hungarian keeper spilled it, and Morlock, alert, relentless, pounced. The ball slid over the line, 2-1. Suddenly, something shifted. The Hungarians frowned. The German players didn't celebrate wildly. They simply jogged back to the halfway line, drenched but defiant. Minutes later, it happened again. Fritz Walter, the captain, lofted a curling pass into the Hungarian box. The ball deflected, bouncing awkwardly through puddles. Rahn controlled it, feinted left, then right, and fired. The net rippled, 2-2. 18 minutes played. The impossible, once unthinkable, was alive. The stadium roared, not just in joy, but in disbelief. The Germans, those underestimated factory workers, were matching the greatest football team on earth. Zimmermann's voice on the radio grew almost lyrical. Rahn, schießt, Tor für Deutschland. Rahn shoots. Goal for Germany. In homes across the nation, people froze. Radios crackled in kitchens and taverns, entire streets erupted. In that moment, the country that had been divided by guilt and rubble was united, by football, by sound, by one impossible dream. But the war, the football war, was far from over. Hungary regrouped. Their passes sharpened, their tempo returned. Hidekuti began to dictate play again, pulling defenders wide, creating lanes for Kocsis to strike. Each attack was surgical, yet every shot seemed to slide just wide, smothered by Turek's gloves or swallowed by the muddy pitch. It was no longer the ballet of the Magyars, it was trench warfare. Herberger's system, tight, compact, almost militaristic, forced Hungary into frustration. Whenever Puskás drifted forward, Werner Kohlmeier shadowed him like a ghost. Whenever Hidekuti dropped deep, Liebrich closed the door. And still, the rain fell. By halftime, the score remained level, 2-2, but the balance of belief had shifted. Herberger gathered his players in the dressing room, speaking not with grand gestures but with quiet certainty. "They are tired," he said. "They are cold. Keep the shape, keep your courage. The longer it rains, the stronger we become." Outside, the Hungarian camp was different. They argued, cursed the weather, the pitch, the referee. Puskás, grimacing with pain, tried to rally them. "We're still the better team," he said. "We just have to play our game." But that was the problem. It wasn't their game anymore. The storm had rewritten it. As the second half began, the Germans pressed higher, not recklessly, methodically. Every interception was followed by a quick transition, every tackle a surge forward. Rahn, Schäfer and Morlock ran as though driven by something beyond fatigue. Zimmermann's commentary began to take on an edge of disbelief. "The Germans are fighting like lions," he said. "Every man gives everything, every ball, every breath." Then came the 84th minute, the moment that would echo for generations. The score still 2-2, the rain still falling, the clock ticking toward eternity. Fritz Walter picked up the ball in midfield. He looked up, saw space on the right, and slid a pass to Rahn. Rahn controlled. A defender lunged. Rahn feinted, once, twice. Then, from just outside the penalty area, he unleashed a left-footed strike. It sliced through the rain like lightning. The Hungarian keeper Gyula Grosics stretched, fingertips grazing air. The ball smashed into the net. Zimmermann's voice cracked into legend. "Rahn, schießt! Tor, 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 Tor für Deutschland!" The crowd erupted. The stands trembled. For a moment, even the rain seemed to pause. 3-2. Herberger didn't move. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "So ist es gut. So it is good." But the war wasn't over. Hungary, desperate, poured forward. In the final minutes, Puskás found a seam, slipped through, and fired the equalizer, or so it seemed. The linesman's flag shot up, offside. The Germans didn't celebrate. They simply held their breath. Time slowed to agony. In the 87th minute, Kocsis headed against the bar. In the 89th, Hidekuti shot inches wide. Turek, soaked to the bone, dove again and again, a man possessed. Zimmermann screamed into his microphone, "Tony, du bist ein Teufelskerl. Tony, you're a devil of a guy." When the final whistle blew, no one moved at first. It was too much to believe. Then it hit. A wave of realization, of release. The Germans had done the unthinkable. They had defeated the unbeatable. The rain still fell, but now it felt like baptism. In that soaked Swiss stadium, amid the cries of disbelief and joy, history had turned a page. The world would call it a miracle. But for the men in white, it was simply proof. That discipline could humble genius, that unity could defeat perfection, and that sometimes redemption arrives in the most unexpected weather. The war was over. The miracle had begun. For a moment after the final whistle, there was no sound. Just the rain, steady, endless, dripping from the crossbar, from the flags, from the faces of men who could hardly understand what they had done. Then, slowly, it began. A murmur, a shout, a roar. The stands erupted, a sound that seemed to come not only from Wankdorf Stadium, but from every corner of a broken continent. West Germany, the uninvited guest, the team mocked by their own, had defeated the greatest football side the world had ever seen. Fritz Walter stood still in the deluge, arms at his sides, eyes unfocused. For 10 years he had carried the ghosts of his past, the war, the camps, the silence. Now, as rain poured down his face, It was as if those ghosts were finally washing away. He looked up, then to his teammates, and only then allowed himself a single trembling smile. Helmut Rahn was surrounded, lifted off the ground by teammates, coaches, even strangers. The man who had scored twice against Hungary, including the winning goal, could barely speak. He was drenched, exhausted, radiant. Reporters swarmed him. All he managed to say between gasps was, "I just hit it, and it went in." Sepp Herberger stayed at the edge of the pitch, coat dripping, hat soaked through. His face gave nothing away. To the players who ran to him, shouting, embracing, he simply nodded. "Now," he said softly, "now you understand why we train this way." In that single sentence lived a philosophy, a lifetime of belief. Victory born not from chance, but from preparation, from Ordnung, from patience, from the quiet resilience of men who had already survived the worst thing a human being could endure. As the Hungarian players knelt in the mud, disbelief written across their faces, the contrast between the two teams was almost biblical. For the Magyars, this was not just defeat, it was collapse. 4 years unbeaten, Olympic champions, conquerors of England, undone by rain, by grit, by a team that refused to be scripted. Ferenc Puskás limped toward Fritz Walter and extended a hand. No bitterness, only grace. "You deserved it," he said quietly. Walter took his hand and held it longer than a moment required. Both men knew what it meant. That football, in its purest form, could bridge even the deepest scars between nations. When the medals were handed out, the rain finally began to ease. The players, covered in mud, sweat, and disbelief, gathered for the anthem. The West German flag rose, and a strange silence fell across the crowd. Many in attendance, from Switzerland, Hungary, even Britain, looked on with mixed feelings. But in living rooms across West Germany, where millions listened by radio, the sound was overwhelming. People wept. Strangers embraced in streets. For a nation denied symbols of pride for nearly a decade, the victory in Bern was more than a sports triumph. It was the first moment they could feel proud of something again. Zimmermann's final commentary lines were already becoming legend. His voice cracked as he cried, "Es ist aus, 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 das Spiel ist aus. Deutschland ist Weltmeister." It's over, over. Germany are world champions. He broke protocol, shouting praise, his voice trembling with tears. Then he spoke words that would be replayed for generations. "Tony, du bist ein Teufelskerl. Du bist ein Fußballgott. Tony, you're a devil of a guy. You're a football god." To modern ears, it might sound exaggerated. But in 1954, it was catharsis, the release of a decade's worth of silence and shame of being told that Germans could never again be proud of anything bearing their flag. In Bern that night, the celebrations were subdued, almost reverent. The players didn't dance or boast. They sat quietly in the locker room, steam rising from their wet kits, exhausted beyond joy. Herberger entered last, looked at each of them, and said simply, "You have given something back to your people. They will not forget." Rahn raised his head. "We did it for you, coach." Herberger smiled faintly. "No," he said, "you did it for each other." Outside, reporters called it a miracle. Das Wunder von Bern. They wrote that no one could explain it logically, that the gods of sport had intervened. But Herberger knew better. He had seen every moment, planned every detail. To him, it wasn't divine intervention. It was human will, forged in hardship, hardened by failure, and finally rewarded by fate. For the Hungarian team, the silence was unbearable. Inside their own dressing room, tears flowed freely. Puskás sat with his head in his hands. "We were the better team," he whispered. But not today. That night, as the team buses rolled through the quiet Swiss roads, the two nations passed each other, one heading toward jubilation, the other toward heartbreak. A Hungarian journalist described it later. "We saw them, their bus lit by interior lamps. They looked calm, almost gentle. And then I realized they didn't steal victory. They earned it. In Germany, Word spread faster than anyone thought possible. Before dawn, church bells rang. In Cologne, Hamburg, Munich, and the ruins of Berlin, people poured into the streets. The sound of celebration felt almost foreign, hesitant at first, then full, unstoppable. Children waved makeshift flags. Old soldiers cried openly. For a generation raised on silence, the voice of Herbert Zimmermann, shouting "Deutschland ist Weltmeister," became something sacred, a sound that signaled rebirth. At that moment, the miracle of Bern stopped being a football match. It became a story, a myth, a national scripture. In the damp Swiss night, the players boarded their train back to Germany. Fritz Walter looked out the window as the rain eased and said quietly to Rahn, "Strange, isn't it? We came here as nobodies." Rahn grinned, tapping the window pane. "Then let's go home as something better." The train disappeared into the dark, carrying not just the world champions, but the first glimmer of a new German identity. When the train crossed the border back into West Germany, it was still early morning. The mist hung low over the fields, and the tracks glistened like threads of silver in the dawn. Inside the carriages, the players slept with their medals still around their necks, their boots drying in paper bags, their minds trying to make sense of what had just happened. But outside, the country was already awake. In every town, at every station, crowds gathered. Men in work clothes, women clutching newspapers, children waving flags made from handkerchiefs. They had all come to see their heroes, the first symbols of national pride since the war. When the train pulled into Munich, it was greeted like a royal procession. Bands played, church bells rang, and thousands lined the platforms. Fritz Walter stepped out first, humble as ever, bowing slightly to the crowd. He looked almost embarrassed by the noise. Beside him, Helmut Rahn grinned like a man who'd just gotten away with something impossible. For once, Germany was not being cheered for conquest or power. It was being cheered for perseverance, for discipline, for something pure. Newspapers across the world ran the same phrase, "The miracle of Bern." It was more than a headline. It was an exhale, the release of tension that had gripped a nation for nearly a decade. In West Germany, the government could hardly believe the unity it witnessed. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer called it a gift of grace to our people. Sociologists would later write that July 4, 1954, was the day the young Federal Republic found its soul, when ordinary citizens stopped identifying with defeat and began to believe in a shared future. The victory gave the country a new rhythm. Radios replayed Zimmermann's ecstatic commentary on loop. Streets echoed with his words, "Es ist aus. Deutschland ist Weltmeister." For the older generation, the sound was healing. For the young, it was a promise. The players themselves returned to their ordinary lives. They weren't millionaires or celebrities. Rahn went back to Essen, where he worked for a car manufacturer. Morlock resumed his job at a local workshop. Fritz Walter returned to Kaiserslautern, where he continued playing for his hometown club and visiting youth academies to tell children that the world could be rebuilt, one goal at a time. And Sepp Herberger, the man who had planned it all, returned to his quiet routines. He was celebrated, yes, but he always insisted that his players had written the real story. When asked years later what his secret was, he smiled faintly and said, "The ball is round," as if that alone could explain how he had turned rubble into gold. For the Hungarians, the loss was harder to bear. The team never recovered. Within 2 years, political turmoil erupted in Budapest, and the golden generation was scattered. Puskás would defect, playing later for Real Madrid. The team that had once seemed invincible dissolved, their beauty preserved only in memory. And yet, in their fall, they gave football something priceless, a reminder that genius alone is not enough, that sport, like life, can humble even the greatest. For decades after, the miracle of Bern lived not just as a sporting triumph, but as a parable. It became the defining story of post-war Germany, a tale of humility, discipline, and rebirth. Films were made. Streets were named. Each new generation grew up hearing about the rain in Bern, the muddy boots, the underdogs who rewrote destiny. But the real miracle wasn't just the score. It was what came after. For the first time since 1945, Germans could celebrate themselves without shame. They could look at their flag and see not tyranny, but triumph. That subtle shift, from guilt to gratitude, from despair to hope, changed the country's psychology. Sociologists later called it the emotional founding of the Federal Republic. In the years that followed, West Germany transformed. Its economy surged. Its culture flourished. Its people, once reluctant to speak of the past, began to dream of the future. And though football could not erase history, it gave the nation something to build upon, a shared moment of pride that belonged to no ideology, no regime, only to the people themselves. Fritz Walter never forgot that. In his later years, he often said that the real victory wasn't the gold medal, but what it did for the hearts of millions who had forgotten how to feel joy. When he passed away in 2002, his hometown renamed their stadium Fritz Walter Stadion. Every time it rains there, fans still whisper the same phrase, Fritz Walter Wetter, and remember the day the skies opened in Bern. Helmut Rahn lived more quietly, haunted at times by the fame he never sought. In interviews, he always downplayed his goal. It was just football, he'd say. But the world knew better. That left-footed strike had carried the weight of a nation. And Herberger, the quiet architect, lived to see Germany win again in 1974. By then, the country was different, stronger, freer. Yet when asked which victory meant more, he always smiled and said, Bern. Because in 1954, we won ourselves back. Even today, when historians discuss Germany's post-war rebirth, they speak not just of economics or politics, but of that rainy day in Switzerland, when 11 men in white shirts stood against history itself and refused to bow. The match ended long ago. The rain stopped. The stadium emptied. But the echo of Herbert Zimmermann's voice still hangs in the air, not just as commentary but as prophecy. Deutschland ist Weltmeister, because that cry was never just about football. It was about rebirth, of a team, a nation, a spirit once thought lost. And in that storm in Bern, beneath grey skies and pounding rain, Germany found the courage to believe again. And if this story moved you, if the echoes of the World Cup still make your heart beat a little faster, stay with us. More journeys, more legends, more moments that shape the world's game are still to come. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join this growing community of football storytellers, because the past is never just history. It's the heartbeat of everything still to come.